Imagine this. You're a soldier. You've been fighting for years. You've seen things that will haunt you for the rest of your life. You've killed men you didn't know. You've watched friends die in mud and snow and fire. And you've been told that the enemy is pure evil, that they represent everything wrong with humanity, that they must be destroyed completely and utterly. Now imagine that on the very last day of that war, you're standing next to one of those enemies, not as prisoners, not as defeated men being marched away, but as brothers in arms, fighting together, bleeding together, dying together to save innocent lives. This isn't a Hollywood movie. This isn't a fictional story written by someone who wanted to show us that peace is possible. This actually happened. In May 1945, as World War II was gasping its final breaths, American soldiers and German soldiers, men who had been trying to kill each other for years, stood shoulder to shoulder at Castle Itter in Austria. They fought together against the SS, the Nazi regime's most fanatical enforcers. And in doing so, they participated in perhaps the most extraordinary, most human moment of the entire war. But here's what's terrifying about this story. It's not just a feel-good tale about enemies becoming friends. It's a window into something darker. It's a glimpse into how fragile our categories really are. Good and evil, friend and enemy. It shows us that these divisions are far more complex than we want to believe. And it raises a question that we still haven't fully answered. What do we do when our enemies are no longer the monolith we thought they were? This is a story about the end of World War II, but it's also a story about human nature, about desperation, about the moments when ideology shatters and reality forces us to see each other as human beings instead of as symbols of abstract evil. Let me take you back to May 1945. The war in Europe is essentially over. Germany has surrendered. Hitler is dead. The Nazi regime is collapsing. But the collapse isn't clean. It's not instant. It's chaotic and violent and unpredictable. You see, when a totalitarian regime starts to crumble, something strange happens. The hold of ideology loosens. People who are absolutely committed to the system suddenly start questioning it, or they start trying to save themselves, or they start looking for ways to negotiate with the approaching enemy. But the SS, the Schutzstaffel, they were different. These were the true believers. These were the men who had dedicated themselves completely to Nazism. And as the regime collapsed around them, they didn't surrender. They didn't accept defeat. Instead, they became more violent, more desperate, more willing to commit atrocities. Because the SS understood something that scared them. Once the war was over, there would be trials. There would be accountability. There would be justice. And the SS knew what they had done. They knew the camps. They knew the experiments. They knew the massacres. They knew they were facing either execution or life imprisonment. So, in those final days of the war, the SS wasn't trying to win anymore. They were trying to survive, and they were willing to do absolutely anything to do so. Now, let me tell you about Castle Itter. It's a real castle in the Tyrol region of Austria, near the town of Virgil. It's been standing for hundreds of years. It's built on a hill overlooking the valley. It has medieval walls and towers. It looks like something out of a storybook. In May 1945, Castle Itter held prisoners. But not military prisoners, not soldiers captured in combat. These were VIP prisoners, French prisoners. General Honoré Giraud, General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, several other high-ranking French military and political figures. These were men of immense importance to France, men who could shape the future of their nation. Why were they imprisoned there? Because Hitler had seen them as valuable bargaining chips. Keeping French generals and politicians prisoner meant having leverage over France. It meant having hostages. It meant having power. But now, with the war essentially over, with American forces racing across Europe and German forces in complete disarray, the question became, what happens to these prisoners? Do they get liberated? Do they get executed? Do they become part of some last-ditch negotiation? That question became urgent on May 4, 1945. An SS captain named Lee arrived at Castle Itter with specific orders. The prisoners were to be executed, every single one of them. The SS captain understood that as long as these French VIPs were alive, they could testify, they could point fingers, they could identify war criminals. But if they were dead, then the SS could claim ignorance, could claim they didn't know what happened, could try to blend back into civilian life. So the order came down, kill them all. But here's where things get complicated. Because at Castle Itter, there was also a Wehrmacht officer. His name was Major Franz Kottmann. Now, the Wehrmacht was the regular German army, not the SS, not the fanatical elite, just regular soldiers, mostly conscripted, mostly just trying to survive. And Major Kottmann faced a choice. He could follow the SS order, he could let the French prisoners be executed, he could be complicit in their murder, or he could refuse. Do you understand what that choice meant? Do you feel the weight of it? Refusing an order in Nazi Germany meant potentially being shot yourself. It meant being labeled a traitor. It meant risking everything. But Major Kottmann made his choice. He decided to protect the French prisoners. He decided to stand against the SS order, even knowing what that could cost him. Now, what if I told you that at almost the same moment, on the other side of the valley, American forces were approaching? An American captain named Bernd Aufrankes, commanding a small cavalry unit, was racing through the Austrian countryside trying to find French prisoners who were supposed to be in this region. The American orders were clear: liberate any French VIPs, get them to safety, protect them at all costs. So you have this incredible convergence. A German officer defying the SS to protect French prisoners, and an American unit racing to find and liberate those same prisoners. And somewhere in the middle, the SS was closing in, determined to execute everyone before the Americans could arrive. The American cavalry unit, under Captain Aufrankes, reached the valley near Castle Itter on May 5, 1945. They were exhausted. They'd been fighting for months. They'd seen the worst of humanity. The last thing they expected was to find an opportunity to work with German officers, but that's exactly what they found. Because Major Kottmann, seeing the American forces approaching and knowing the SS was preparing to execute the French prisoners, made a decision. He sent out a white flag, he made contact with Captain Aufrankes, and he asked for help. Can you imagine that conversation? Can you picture it? An American captain, trained to see all Germans as enemies, being asked by a German major to join forces against the SS? Captain Aufrankes could have refused. He could have shot Kottmann on sight. It would have been within military protocol. Kottmann was a German officer. He wore a German uniform. He represented the enemy. But Aufrankes understood something crucial. The real enemy right now wasn't the regular German army. The real enemy was the SS. The real enemy was the fanaticism that refused to accept defeat. So Aufrankes made the decision to work with Kottmann, to work with a German officer, to defend Castle Itter against the SS. Now let me describe what happened next, because this is where the story becomes truly dramatic, where you can feel the tension, where you can almost hear the gunfire echoing off the castle walls. The SS was approaching the castle. About 150 of them, well armed, well organized, and absolutely determined to execute everyone in that castle before the Americans could stop them. They had vehicles, they had machine guns, they had the training and the fanaticism of true believers. Standing against them, approximately 30 men. American soldiers, German Wehrmacht soldiers, French prisoners who were armed to defend themselves, 30 men, against 150 Nazi fanatics. The odds were impossible, absolutely impossible, and yet on May 5, 1945, they fought anyway. The SS attacked the castle. They came up the hill, trying to overwhelm the defenders. Machine gun fire erupted. You could hear the rounds striking the ancient stone walls. You could smell the cordite in the air. The French prisoners who had been expecting to die were suddenly armed and fighting for their lives. And there, in the thick of it, were Americans and Germans fighting side by side. There's a story that I want to tell you because it captures something essential about what happened that day. There was a Wehrmacht officer named Major Franz Kottmann, the same major who had defied the SS order to execute the French prisoners. He was fighting on the castle walls, defending the position, and he was shot. He was hit by machine gun fire, and he fell from the wall. He didn't die immediately. He lay there on the ground, outside the castle, wounded and bleeding. And you know who went to help him? American soldiers. American soldiers, who were supposed to see him as an enemy, climbed down from the castle to retrieve him. They brought him back inside. They treated his wounds. They saved his life. Feel that. Feel the humanity in that moment. Feel what it means for a soldier to see another soldier, an enemy soldier, as someone worth saving. The battle raged for hours. The SS kept attacking. The defenders kept fighting back. And somehow, against all odds, they held the castle. They held their position. They prevented the SS from executing the French prisoners. Eventually, as more American forces arrived in the valley, the SS realized the situation was hopeless. They withdrew. They retreated. The battle was over. Now, you might think the story ends there, but it doesn't, because what happened after the battle is just as important as the battle itself. After the fighting stopped, after the shooting ended, the Americans and Germans had to deal with the aftermath. Captain O'Frankis faced a choice about what to do with the German soldiers who had fought alongside his men. Should they be taken prisoner? Should they be treated as enemies? But Captain O'Frankis understood something profound. These weren't the fanatics who had perpetuated the Holocaust. These weren't the true believers in the Nazi ideology. These were regular soldiers who had done the right thing when it mattered most. They had defied their own regime to save innocent lives. So O'Frankis made a decision that was technically against military protocol. He allowed the German soldiers to walk away. He let them go free. He gave them a chance at redemption. Major Kottmann survived his wounds. He recovered. And after the war, he lived out his days in Austria, a man who had chosen to do the right thing in the moment when it mattered most. Now, here's what I want you to understand about this story, because it's not just a touching tale about enemies becoming allies. It's a profound statement about human nature and moral choice. In our modern world, we tend to see everything in binary terms, good or evil, us or them, friend or enemy. We're uncomfortable with nuance. We're uncomfortable with the idea that people might be complex, that people might contain contradictions, that a man who wears the uniform of an evil regime might still choose to do the right thing when faced with a choice. But the battle for Castle Itter shows us that this complexity is real. It shows us that even in the midst of totalitarianism, even in the midst of a regime dedicated to evil, there were individuals who could recognize that evil and choose to stand against it. Major Kottmann didn't have to defy the SS order. Nobody would have blamed him if he hadn't. The SS could have executed him if he'd resisted, but he resisted anyway. He did the right thing, knowing it could cost him his life. And Captain O'Frankis didn't have to work with Kottmann. He could have viewed him as just another German soldier, just another enemy. But he recognized in Kottmann a kindred spirit, a man trying to do the right thing, a man worth fighting alongside. This is what separates us from our worst impulses. The ability to see the other person as human, the ability to recognize moral choices, even in our enemies, the ability to choose to do the right thing, even when it's difficult or dangerous. If you're still here, you're about to uncover something troubling, because the battle for Castle Itter raises questions that we still haven't fully answered in our modern world. In World War II, the categories seemed clear. Nazis were evil, Allies were good, but as this story shows, reality was more complicated. There were good people in bad uniforms. There were brave acts committed by people fighting for an evil regime. There were men who saw the darkness around them and chose to stand against it. What does that mean for how we judge people? What does it mean for how we approach our enemies today? Think about this. What if we approached our modern conflicts with this same nuance? What if we recognized that our political opponents might not be pure evil? What if we recognized that people we disagree with might still be capable of moral choices? What if we tried to find common ground based on human values rather than on abstract ideology? I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not saying we should give a free pass to people or systems that do evil things. The Nazi regime was evil. It perpetuated the Holocaust. It started a war that killed millions. These are facts that cannot be erased or excused. But the fact remains, even within that evil system, there were individuals who made moral choices. And when we recognize those choices, When we celebrate those choices, we're also sending a message to people living under totalitarian regimes today. We're saying, your choices matter. Standing up against evil is possible. You won't be forgotten. Here's something that history doesn't often talk about. Something that gets lost in the celebration of the battle for Castle Itter. Many of the French prisoners who were saved that day had complicated histories themselves. General Honoré Giraud, one of the men they were protecting, he had a complex relationship with the Nazi occupation. He'd been involved in political maneuvering, in negotiations, and attempts to navigate the treacherous waters of French politics during the war. He wasn't a saint. He was a political figure, doing what he thought was necessary to survive. General Jean de Latve de Tassigny, he would later become a controversial figure in French politics, involved in colonial conflicts and political machinations. These men weren't pure heroes. They were complicated figures navigating an impossible situation, and yet they deserved to be saved. They deserved to have their lives protected from the SS. This is what's important about the battle for Castle Itter. It's not a story of pure good triumphing over pure evil. It's a story of imperfect people doing the right thing in an imperfect situation. And that's actually more inspiring than a simple good versus evil narrative, because it means that we don't have to be perfect to do the right thing. We don't have to be heroes. We just have to be willing in the moment when it matters to choose correctly. Let me tell you about what happened to Captain Bern Francus after the war, because this is where the story gets even more interesting. Francus survived the war. He made it back to America. He continued his military career, but he carried Castle Itter with him. He never forgot the moment when he chose to work with a German officer. He never forgot the choice that Major Kottmann made to defy the SS. Years later, Francus would speak about that day. He would describe it as one of the most significant moments of his life. Not because they won a great victory in military terms. Castle Itter wasn't strategically important. It didn't change the course of the war. But because in that moment, he had witnessed something that gave him hope about humanity. He had witnessed a moment when ideology stepped back and humanity stepped forward, when the abstract categories of enemy and ally became less important than the concrete reality of saving human lives. This is what we need to remember. This is what we need to carry with us into our modern world, that no matter how divided we are, no matter how much we disagree, no matter how strong our ideological positions are, there are still moments when we can choose to work together. There are still moments when we can recognize the humanity in people we thought were our enemies. Now, I want to pivot for a moment and talk about what this means for us today, because the lessons of Castle Itter aren't historical curiosities. They're not just interesting stories from the past. They're urgent messages for the present. In our modern world, we're facing increasing polarization. We're seeing society split into opposing camps. We're seeing demonization of people on the other side of political divides. We're seeing the erosion of the ability to see our opponents as human beings. What if we brought the spirit of Castle Itter into our modern conflicts? What if we recognized that people we disagree with politically are still humans worthy of respect? What if we looked for opportunities to work together even across deep divides? I'm not suggesting that this is easy. I'm not suggesting that all conflicts can be resolved through understanding, but I am saying that the first step toward any resolution is recognizing the humanity of the other side. And Castle Itter shows us that this is possible, even in the midst of total war, even when we're literally trying to kill each other. Even then, we can find moments where we see each other as human. Here's what's crucial about the battle for Castle Itter that nobody really talks about. It changed the narrative of the war's ending. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, just 3 days after the battle for Castle Itter. When the war officially ended, people wanted stories that would help them make sense of what had happened. They wanted stories that would help them heal. The battle for Castle Itter provided that. It showed that even in the midst of an evil system, there were people who chose to do the right thing. It showed that enemies could become allies. It showed that humanity could persist even when everything around you was designed to destroy it. In the years immediately after the war, the story was told and retold. It became a symbol of hope, a symbol that the war, despite all its horrors, had moments of profound human dignity. But then, something happened. The Cold War began, and the narrative changed. Suddenly, Germany wasn't just Germany anymore. It was divided. It was a battleground between democracy and communism. The story of Castle Itter didn't fit neatly into the new narrative. It was too complicated, too nuanced, too human. So the story faded. It became less well known. It was overshadowed by other narratives about the war. For decades, very few people knew about the battle for Castle Itter. It was a footnote in history, a small story that didn't fit into the larger narratives about World War II. But in recent years, the story has resurfaced. People have become interested in it again. They've researched it. They've written about it. They've made documentaries about it. And the reason is clear. We need this story now more than ever. We need to be reminded that even in total conflict, even when we see our enemies as absolutely evil, there are still moments when we can recognize shared humanity. We need to be reminded that doing the right thing is possible, even when it's dangerous or difficult. We need to be reminded that ideological divides don't have to be absolute. If you're still here, let me pose a difficult question. What would you have done if you were Captain Francus? Would you have trusted a German officer approaching with a white flag in the final days of World War II? Would you have been willing to work with someone who wore a Nazi uniform, even if he seemed to be defying the regime? It's easy to say yes now. It's easy to celebrate the decision when we know it worked out. But put yourself in that moment. You've been fighting for years. You've seen atrocities. You've lost friends. You've been taught to see all Germans as enemies. And now a German officer is asking you to trust him. Asking you to work with him. Asking you to put your men's lives at risk by fighting alongside him. That takes incredible courage. That takes incredible moral clarity. Captain Francus had both, and we should acknowledge that. But here's what's interesting. Francus later said that his decision wasn't based on moral philosophy or abstract principles. It was based on something simpler. He looked at Major Kottmann and he saw a man who was trying to do the right thing. He saw someone who had already defied an evil order, and he recognized that this man was worth fighting alongside. It was that simple. Not ideology. Not geopolitics, not strategic calculation, just human recognition. One person seeing the moral choice in another person and deciding to support it. This is what we've lost in our modern world. This ability to see the other person. This ability to recognize moral choices even in people we disagree with. This ability to find common ground based on human values. Let me tell you something that happened after the war that really captures the meaning of Castle Itter. Major Kottmann, after recovering from his wounds, was trying to figure out what to do with his life. The Germany he had known was destroyed. The regime he had served was gone. He was starting over with nothing. Captain Francus, back in America, heard about Kottmann's situation, and Francus did something remarkable. He used his connections. He helped Kottmann get a visa to come to America. He sponsored him. He gave him a job. Two men who had met in combat. Two men who represented opposing sides in a total war. And when that war was over, Francus didn't abandon Kottmann. He helped him build a new life. That's what happens when you see the other person as human. That's what happens when you recognize the moral choices they've made. You don't just cooperate with them in the moment of crisis. You maintain that connection. You maintain that recognition of shared humanity even when the crisis has passed. Now, let me bring this back to something crucial. What if things had gone differently at Castle Itter? What if Captain Francus had refused to work with Major Kottmann? What if he'd shot Kottmann when he approached with the white flag? What if he treated him as just another enemy? The French prisoners would still have been liberated eventually. American forces were overwhelming. The SS couldn't have held out forever. But the moment would have been different. The meaning would have been different. Instead of a moment of unexpected human connection, it would have been just another victory for the Allies. Just another castle taken from the Germans. Just another military success. But because Francus made the choice he made, because he saw Kottmann as a human being worthy of working with, The moment became something more. It became a statement about human possibility, a statement that even in total war, humanity could persist, that even enemies could find common cause. And that statement matters. It matters because it gives us hope. It matters because it shows us what's possible when we choose to see the other person as human. Let me tell you about the survivors of Castle Itter, the French generals who were saved that day. What happened to them after the war? General Honoré Giraud lived until 1949. He spent the last years of his life in relative obscurity, writing memoirs, reflecting on the war. He never achieved the political prominence in post-war France that he might have hoped for, but he survived. He had a chance to live out his life, and that was because of what happened at Castle Itter. General Jean de Lattre de Tessigny went on to have a very significant post-war career. He became a key figure in French military circles. He commanded French forces in Indochina. He became a general of great renown. And when he died in 1952, he was honored as a great military leader. He had his life extended because of Castle Itter. There were other prisoners too, officers and political figures who would go on to shape French society in the post-war period. And all of them owed their lives to the decision made at Castle Itter, to the choice to work together, to the recognition of shared humanity. What if they hadn't been saved? What if the SS had succeeded in executing them? The course of French history after the war might have been different. Significant leaders wouldn't have been there to guide their nation. Leadership gaps would have been filled by different people. Society would have developed differently. This is the power of moral choice. This is what happens when individuals choose to do the right thing. It ripples forward to history. It affects not just their immediate situation, but the entire future. Now, here's something that will send chills down your spine. In our modern world, we can see the exact opposite of Castle Itter playing out in various conflicts. We see people refusing to work with those across political divides, even on issues where collaboration would serve mutual interests. We see demonization of opponents rather than attempts to recognize their humanity. We see the hardening of ideological positions and the refusal to see those on the other side as worthy of respect or cooperation. What if we brought the spirit of Castle Itter into these modern conflicts? What if we said, I recognize that you are a human being. I recognize that you are capable of moral choices. I recognize that we might be able to work together on issues where we share common ground, even if we disagree on other issues. This doesn't mean giving up on our principles. It doesn't mean abandoning our positions. But it does mean maintaining our recognition of each other's humanity. It does mean being willing to cooperate when cooperation serves the greater good. The world is watching. The history books are watching. And they will judge us not just on what we believe, but on how we treat those who disagree with us, on whether we maintain our humanity even in conflict. Castle Itter is a reminder that this is possible, that we have the capacity to choose this path, that even in total war, even when we see the other side as absolutely evil, there can still be moments of human recognition and cooperation. As we face the challenges of our modern world, we would do well to remember this. We would do well to carry the spirit of Castle Itter with us, to look for opportunities to see the other person as human, to look for opportunities to cooperate based on shared values rather than on abstract ideology, because the alternative, a world where we see our opponents as pure evil, where we refuse to recognize their humanity, where we refuse to work together, even on issues where cooperation would serve us all, that's a world that leads to escalating conflict. That's a world that leads to violence. That's a world where the worst in us wins. But Castle Itter shows us a different possibility. It shows us that even in the midst of total war, we can choose differently. We can choose to see each other as human. We can choose to work together. And in doing so, we can create moments of profound meaning and dignity. This is the legacy of Castle Itter. This is what we should take from this story. Not just the military victory, not just the interesting historical anecdote, but the profound statement about human possibility. The statement that we are capable of recognizing humanity in our enemies, that we are capable of cooperation across divides, that we are capable of making moral choices even when it's difficult and dangerous, As you go forward in your life, remember Castle Itter. Remember Captain Ofrancus and Major Kottmann. Remember that French generals and German soldiers and American soldiers all worked together to protect innocent lives. And remember that you too have the capacity to make choices like this, to see the humanity in people you disagree with, to look for common cause with people you thought were enemies. The world needs more Castle Itter. The world needs more moments where humanity triumphs over ideology, where cooperation triumphs over conflict, where we recognize each other as human beings worthy of respect and dignity. This is possible. Castle Itter proved it. Now it's up to us to choose it.